a lavish gala. A crowd in sparkling gowns and tuxedos gathers around a gleaming grand piano. Laughter ripples through the room as a wealthy host smirks at the janitor standing quietly nearby. "If you can play this piano," the host declares, "I'll marry you." The room bursts into mocking chuckles until the first note changes everything. The chandeliers glittered like constellations overhead, their golden light bathing the grand hall in a glow of wealth and refinement. Crystal glasses clinked, delicate. Laughter danced through the air, and the soft hum of expensive conversation filled the space like a carefully orchestrated symphony of privilege. The marble floors shone so perfectly they mirrored the gleaming shoes of the elegantly dressed guests who swayed between tables draped in white silk. At the center of the room sat a magnificent grand piano, its black lacquered surface polished to a mirror sheen like a jewel displayed in a velvet box. Nobody touched it. It was more of a centerpiece than an instrument tonight, a symbol of culture and taste, reserved for the evening's planned performer. Against this backdrop of opulence, a figure moved quietly and unnoticed, weaving between clusters of guests. A man in a simple work uniform, pushing a cleaning cart. Pausing here and there to straighten a chair or wipe a stray fingerprint from the edge of a table. His movements were deliberate and efficient, practiced from years of service, yet invisible to those around him. Eyes slid past him, as if he were part of the furniture. A few glanced his way only to smirk or whisper, their words muffled but dripping. With the casual disdain of people who believed themselves above him, near the bar, the host of the evening, a person whose wealth was matched only by their appetite for attention, stood surrounded by admirers. A glass of expensive champagne tilted in their hand as they regaled the crowd with yet another exaggerated story, the kind told more for the performance than for truth. Oh, yes. Their cheeks were flushed with drink, their laugh a little too loud. Their gaze drifted lazily over the crowd. It landed on the janitor. Smirk curved their lips, the kind that spelled trouble for whoever was its target. They leaned closer to their audience and whispered something that made the group chuckle in anticipation. Then, with a dramatic flourish, they raised their voice so the entire room could hear. "Tell you what," they declared, gesturing toward the piano with a flourish that sent diamond bracelets glinting in the light. "If this fine gentleman here can play that piano, truly play a tile, marry him." The words were thick with mockery, and the ripple of laughter that followed was immediate. The suggestion wasn't taken seriously for even a second. It was a performance. Another story to tell later about how they once made a joke at the help's expense. Guests turned to watch, their faces lit with the cruel curiosity of people who expected to be entertained. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others leaned toward one another to murmur comments they didn't bother to hide. The sound of low chuckles and derisive whispers floated through the air. "Does he even know which end of the piano to sit at?" one man muttered to his date, who giggled behind her glass. "Maybe he'll surprise us with chopsticks," another said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A woman in a beaded gown shook her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Best stick to the mop, darling," she called toward him with mock sweetness. It was the kind of casual cruelty that came not from deep malice, but from a lifetime of assuming someone else's life existed only for your amusement. Through it all, the janitor kept working, his face calm, his eyes lowered, as if he hadn't heard a word. The laughter swelled when he didn't immediately react, the crowd taking his silence as proof of embarrassment. The host's smirk widened, sensing victory in their little game. They sauntered toward the piano, tapping the glossy lid as if inviting him to inspect it. "Come now," they coaxed, voice dripping with false generosity. "Surely you're not afraid? It's just a bit of fun." The words were bait, but the janitor didn't rise to them, not yet. He finished adjusting the chair he'd been straightening. His movements so deliberate, they almost seemed to slow the air in the room. The space between heartbeats stretched, and the anticipation, meant to be a joke, began to coil into something else. The crowd's laughter softened into murmurs, then whispers, as they realized he was no longer cleaning. He was standing still, his gaze fixed on the piano. He took a step forward, and a strange hush began to fall, the way sound dies in the seconds before a storm breaks. Another step, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Some guests still smirked, certain they were moments from watching a disaster unfold. Others tilted their heads, curiosity prickling at the edges of their amusement. The host, sensing the moment had grown more charged than expected, laughed a little too loudly, trying to keep it light. "Well, let's see if we're in for a miracle or a mess," they said. But their voice no longer carried quite the same certainty. The janitor's shoes clicked softly against the marble. As he crossed the open floor, the crowd shifted slightly to give him space, the semicircle around the piano widening in anticipation. A few guests raised their phones, ready to capture the inevitable failure for social media. Close enough now to touch the instrument, he stopped. For a brief second, he looked at the piano with an expression that was almost reverent, his eyes tracing the curves of its body, the gleam of its keys. Then without a word, he walked around to the bench, each movement unhurried, as though time belonged to him and not to the crowd pressing in. He sat down, straightened his back, and placed his hands gently on the keys. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of champagne bubbles rising in crystal glasses. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held, their laughter replaced by a sharper kind of anticipation, the kind that comes when you realize you might have underestimated someone. And then, without warning, the first note rang out. His fingers rested on the keys with the same care a jeweler might show when touching a priceless gem, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to lean in, suspended in the quiet. Then, the first note rose, clear and unshaken, cutting through the expectant air like a single drop of water falling into stillness. It was followed by another, and then a cascade each, tone deep, resonant, as if the piano itself had been waiting for years to speak again. The sound was not the clumsy fumbling the guests had anticipated. It was precise, deliberate, yet alive with something they could not name. The melody swelled, full-bodied and warm, as though the keys had been waiting for these exact hands. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, laughter dried up mid-breath, and the faint clink of glass against glass ceased entirely. One by one, heads turned toward the man at the piano, drawn by the unmistakable truth in the sound. He played not as someone testing an instrument, but as one reacquainting himself with an old friend, someone who knew its secrets, its moods, its voice. His eyes were half-lidded, his body still except for the smooth, graceful movement of his hands gliding from chord to chord. In those hands lived a command over the instrument that went far beyond skill. It was as if each note carried a fragment of his own life, carefully shaped and released into the air. The opening melody held a quiet sorrow, the kind that doesn't beg for pity, but carries dignity in its weight. The guests could feel it, even if they didn't understand it, and without knowing why. They found themselves listening with the same hush one gives to a confession. The music shifted, building in depth and texture, and with it came the faintest flickers of memory in his mind, a small, dimly lit room, walls lined with peeling wallpaper, and a battered upright piano in the corner. A boy, barely tall enough to reach the keys, sat on a wobbly stool, his fingers stretching awkwardly across them, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sheet music, worn and creased from years of turning, rested on the stand. The notes had been his escape from everything that pressed against him in that tiny space. Poverty, silence, and the weight of a world that did not expect much from him. Those same small hands, once clumsy and unsure, had grown steady through countless hours of practice. Despite the chill of the unheated room and the ache in his fingers, back in the present, those hands now broad and marked by years of hard labor moved with effortless grace. Calluses from scrubbing floors and carrying heavy loads were visible even as his fingertips coaxed tenderness from the keys. The contrast was almost jarring, yet beautiful. Hands built for work creating music, delicate enough to still an entire hall. The host, who had been leaning casually on the piano's edge at the start, straightened almost without realizing it, their smirk fading into something unreadable. The glint of mockery in their eyes gave way to a quiet, almost reluctant fascination. The melody evolved, seamlessly shifting from the solemn precision of classical form into the rich improvisation of jazz. His left hand walked the bass notes like an old friend strolling through familiar streets. while his right hand danced in airy, unpredictable patterns that filled the air with warmth. The transition was so smooth that it felt like the natural progression of a single thought, not a change in genre. A few guests exchanged startled looks, eyebrows raised, as though realizing that this was no parlor trick. This was mastery. A woman near the front, her evening gown shimmering under the chandeliers, blinked rapidly and pressed her fingers to the corners of her eyes. She wasn't alone. Others felt an unexpected tightness in their throats, their own reflections in the glossy piano surface softened by the blur of tears they hadn't planned to shed. They didn't fully understand why, only that something in the music was reaching for them, tugging at threads they'd thought long buried. The host's champagne glass hung loosely at their side now, forgotten, the sparkle of the drink catching the light in a still hand. Their head tilted slightly, as if trying to memorize the shape of this moment. The way the man's shoulders moved with each swell in the melody, the unspoken story in his posture. Their laughter from earlier seemed distant, almost like it had belonged to someone else. The music swelled again, sleeping into a soulful refrain that seemed to pour straight from the heart. It was no longer bound by the rules of a single style. Instead, it wove together the discipline of classical, the playfulness of jazz, and the aching sincerity of soul. The piano became a voice deep and resonant one moment, whispering and intimate the next. His foot pressed the pedal with the instinct of muscle memory, letting the notes linger just long enough to echo, then lifting to let silence carve space. For the next phrase, every transition was seamless, each change of pace or tone as natural as breathing. He moved from gentle, lingering phrases to powerful, surging chords that filled the hall like a tide rising against the shore. Heads in the audience swayed slightly, bodies leaning forward as if they could get closer to the sound. A man in the back lowered his phone, realizing instinctively that to record this would be to flatten it, to strip it of the very thing that made it so alive. The room no longer looked like the glittering playground of the wealthy. Under the weight of the music, it had become a place of quiet unity, where every person's attention was tethered to the same point. The murmurs, the smirks, the quiet cruelty from earlier were gone, replaced by an almost reverent silence. Number one dared speak, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter the spell. The janitor's eyes never once scanned the room. His world was the piano, the touch of ivory under his fingertips, the sound blooming from it like breath. Every note he struck seemed inevitable, the exact right thing to say in that exact moment. It was not showmanship, not a bid for approval, but a conversation between him and the musician. The audience was lucky enough to overhear, as the final note of the section resonated, hanging in the air before dissolving into silence. The room felt altered. The guests who had been ready to laugh were now still, caught in something they didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. And though none of them knew it, the man at the piano was just getting started. The melody shifted, deepening into something that felt less like music and more like a memory unfolding. It was as if each note carried a fragment of a life story not written in words, but carved into sound. The slow, deliberate chords spoke of cold mornings and endless work of hands, calloused by labor, yet never too tired to seek the comfort of a piano's keys. The higher notes, bright and fleeting, hinted at moments of joy, brief but unforgettable, like sunlight breaking through clouds for only a few minutes before being swallowed again. Without realizing it, the audience leaned forward, drawn in as though the music itself had hooked its fingers into their ribs and was pulling them closer. The air seemed to thicken, the hall narrowing until it felt as though only two things existed in the world: the man at the piano and the music spilling. From it, those who had laughed earlier now stared at the floor or at their hands, unable to meet the gaze of anyone around them. The shame was subtle but heavy, settling over them like an unwelcome weight. It wasn't just that they had underestimated him, it was that they had done so with such arrogance. Every delicate phrase, every swelling crescendo seemed to expose their earlier cruelty, holding it up in the light for all to see. No one apologized aloud, but the quiet shifting of postures, the averted eyes, said more than words could. The host, who had started the challenge with crossed arms and a smirk, now stood with their arms loose at their sides. The sharp angles of their body had softened, their head tilted slightly as if trying to hear more clearly. Their eyes, once bright with mockery, now held something quieter curiosity laced with respect. And perhaps something more difficult too. Name. They were no longer the conductor of the room's attention. That role belonged entirely to the man seated at the piano. Across the hall, few guests discreetly raised their phones to record, though even this was done with care, as if they feared breaking the moment. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, their breathing slowing to match its rhythm. It was not a performance to be consumed for entertainment. Alone, it was an experience to be absorbed, something that demanded stillness and surrender. The music grew in intensity, the quiet elegance of the earlier passages giving way to something more urgent, more raw. His hands moved faster, the chords heavier, the rhythm pulsing with a heartbeat's insistence. It was as though every hardship he had endured, every door slammed in his face, every hour spent scrubbing floors for people who never saw him, was being poured into the instrument. Yet within that force there was also triumph, moments where the melody soared high and free, breaking through the darkness like a bird lifting off from a storm. The sound seemed to swell beyond the walls of the hall, filling the space so completely that it pressed against the hearts of everyone listening. It became impossible not to imagine the unseen chapters of his life, the boy at the battered piano, the young man working long hours but returning each night to practice in the quiet, the adult whose talent had been hidden beneath a uniform and a mop. The music was not just a display of skill, it was the truth of a life that refused to break. Played in a language everyone could understand but no one could speak. The host's gaze never left him now. Whatever the original dare had been meant, to prove it had dissolved entirely. There was no longer any joke in the air, only the realization that they were witnessing something rare and unrepeatable. Around them, the room felt transformed. The glittering gowns, the champagne, the polished marble, none of it seemed as grand as the music being woven before their eyes. He leaned into the final stretch of the piece, his entire body now part of the sound. His shoulders rose and fell, with each phrase, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to the notes even as he created them. His hands blurred, yet every keystroke was deliberate, every chord full and resonant. There was no strain, only certainty. As if the music had always been inside him, and the piano was merely the doorway through which it passed. The last few measures slowed, the power giving way to tenderness once more. Each note was spaced with care, allowed to linger in the air just long enough for its echo to fade before the next arrived. The audience was utterly still, breaths held, eyes fixed on him. And then came the final note, soft but unyielding, hanging in the air like the last word of a story you know will stay with you forever. The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, as if the music still lingered in the very air they breathed. No one dared to move. No one dared to clap too soon. It was the kind of silence that carried more weight than sound ever could, where the absence of noise was itself an acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. Seconds passed. Though it felt longer, the stillness stretching until it almost became unbearable. Then, as though a signal had been given, the room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, loud and unrestrained, joined by cheers and the sharp crack of hands meeting hands in a rhythm that no longer cared for elegance. Some guests stood immediately, others followed a beat later, until nearly the entire hall was on its feet, their faces moments ago composed with polite detachment, now shone with awe and gratitude. People called out praise, their voices overlapping in a rush of emotion that could no longer be contained. The man at the piano did not bow dramatically or soak in the adoration. He simply sat for a moment, his hands resting quietly in his lap, letting the applause wash over him. If there was satisfaction in his eyes, it was not for the approval he now had, but for the truth he had spoken through the music, a truth no one in that room would ever again be able to ignore. The applause still filled the air when the host began to move forward, steps slow and deliberate, as though they were crossing a great distance rather than a few feet. The smirk that had once curled their lips was gone, replaced by an expression stripped bare of performance. When they reached the piano, they paused, looking at the man seated there as if searching for the right words, and finding none that felt worthy. At last their voice came quieter than anyone had ever heard it that night. They admitted they had never expected such mastery, not from him, not in this setting, not under these circumstances. Their tone was free of the playful lilt it usually carried. It was steady, sincere, and tinged with something like regret. They offered an apology, not the easy kind, tossed off to smooth over social awkwardness, but the kind that cost something to say. They acknowledged the cruelty of the challenge, the thoughtlessness of turning him into the evening's entertainment without a second thought, and they said plainly that they had been wrong. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, as though waiting to see how the man would respond. But before he could speak, a voice rose from the crowd, a guest in an understated suit, their expression one of dawning recognition. They stepped forward, eyes fixed on the pianist, and asked if it could possibly be true. Could he be the same musician who, years ago, had performed on stages across the country? The one whose recordings had once been played on late-night radio, whose concerts had left audiences spellbound. Murmurs swept through the crowd as heads turned toward the speaker. The man at the piano gave no immediate answer, but the faintest flicker of something pain, perhaps, passed through his eyes. The guests continued, their voice now filled with quiet awe. They told the story, how this man had once been celebrated, not just as a skilled pianist, but as a rare talent, a prodigy whose interpretations carried a depth beyond his years. And then, just as his career was reaching its height, he had vanished from the public eye. There had been whispers of a tragedy, a loss that had hollowed him out, though no one ever learned the full truth. He had retreated from the world of concert halls and applause, and over time his name had faded from memory, except for a few who still remembered what it felt like to hear him play. As the truth settled over the room, the admiration in the crowd deepened into something almost reverent. People began to move toward him, not with the idle curiosity of earlier, but with genuine respect. One guest extended a hand and offered him a place at a prestigious music school, teaching the next generation of pianists. Another invited him to perform at an upcoming concert, promising it would be his return to the stage. A well-dressed couple proposed sponsoring an entire tour, covering every expense so he could focus solely on the music. He listened to each offer. With patience, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his gaze steady but distant, as though weighing the meaning of each word rather than its material value. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, carrying the same measured cadence as his. Playing, he thanked them all for their kindness, their generosity, and their recognition. But most offers he declined. He explained that while he was grateful, his relationship with music was not about fame, money, or even the approval of others. For him, music had always been something pure, something sacred, and he had no desire to see it twisted by ego or ambition. He would play when he wished, where he wished, for those who truly wanted to listen, not as a commodity, but as a gift. The host stood nearby, silent, their eyes fixed on him. The words of their original dare marriage as the reward for his playing hung unspoken in the air. No one mentioned them now. The moment had outgrown such trivialities. Yet there was something in the way they looked at him, something softer, and more open than before, a respect that went beyond public acknowledgement. It was the quiet recognition of a person who had been changed, even if they couldn't yet name how. Eventually, the crowd began to drift back toward their tables, though. The mood of the evening had shifted entirely. The glitter of the chandeliers seemed warmer, the air less sharp. Laughter returned, but it was gentler now, stripped of its earlier edge. Conversations carried a new undercurrent, the kind that comes when people know they have witnessed something rare. The man at the piano stood, running one hand lightly over the polished surface, as if in farewell. Then, without ceremony, he stepped away and returned to his duties. The uniform was the same, the work the same, but the way people looked at him had changed entirely. Where before there had been dismissal, there was now nods of acknowledgement. The occasional murmured thank you as he passed. The piano, once a silent ornament, now sat with its lid open, quiet invitation for him to return whenever he chose. As the evening wore on, he moved about the hall as he always had, tending to the small details that kept the place running. But every so often, someone's eyes would linger on the piano, as if half expecting him to sit down again and let the music spill out. He didn't, not that night. It was enough to have played once, to have spoken without words and been heard. Later, as the last guests trickled out and the hall emptied, he paused for a moment near the piano. His reflection glimmered faintly in its black surface, and he allowed himself the smallest of smiles, a smile that carried no triumph, no vanity, only quiet satisfaction. Dignity and art had spoken louder than status or wealth, and in that truth, he found peace. He turned away, the soft sound of his footsteps fading into the hush of the now silent room, leaving the piano behind with its lid still open, waiting.